and welcome to this month's Science Tuesday. I'm your host. I'm Howard Lickman, the program coordinator for the Rockville Science Center. This morning's program is Mushrooms 101 with Matt Cohn. Matt is an outdoor enthusiast and naturalist based in Silver Spring with a particular interest in mushrooms, plants, and birds. Through his business, Matt's Habitats, he leads frequent nature walks, focusing on the identification of mushrooms and plants, as well as their edibility. Matt has been a member of the local mushroom club, the Mycological Association of Washington, since 2005. He is currently the club's treasurer. In his introductory presentation about wild mushrooms, we'll learn about the ecological role of mushrooms, the major group of mushrooms, what traits to look for to identify mushrooms, and some local deadly poisonous mushrooms and edible mushrooms suitable for beginning foragers. Matt, thank you for coming.
All right. You see that?
We do.
Okay, great. All right. Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining in here. Howard already gave me a nice introduction. This presentation was originally done for our local mushroom club, the Mycological Association of Washington, D.C., entitled Mushrooms 101. I'm going to jump right into it. There are a few sections that are kind of natural stopping points where maybe I can take a few questions and then move on if that works for Howard and everybody else. So this is a little image of the diversity of different mushrooms around here. So we're going to go over, as Howard said, these different topics. This generally takes about an hour long. I can shorten it and if need be. So we're going to start off with what are fungi and mushrooms? So all mushrooms are fungi, but not all fungi are mushrooms. So fungi are one of the kingdoms of life. They used to be lumped together with plants, but I think it's been about 50 years or more since they've been officially separated out. So one of the differences between the plants and mushrooms as well as animals is that plants can make their own food through photosynthesis. And fungi and animals cannot. So that actually on the evolutionary tree, fungi and animals are more closely related to each other than either is to plants. And what we have 6 different kingdoms represented here. And I've heard that there might be as many as 20 or 30 one day. So things keep getting divided up. So about 90% of known fungi do not make mushrooms. So most fungi do not make mushrooms. This includes yeasts, molds, rusts, smuts, chytrids. This is a common fungus around here that's pretty easy to identify. It's not a mushroom. This is mountain laurel leaf spot. If you see a mountain laurel around here, if you can identify mountain laurel, which is pretty easy this time of year being an evergreen tree, one of a few evergreen species out there. And you see this little disease on here that's actually caused by a fungus. Baker's yeast is also a fungus, but not a mushroom. And obviously this is very important for culinary purposes, probably more so than all the mushrooms out there. We can't live without bread and other leaven products, can we? So some fungi that make some fungi make mushrooms to spread their spores. And this is analogous to trees that make fruit to spread their seeds. And basically a spore will land on a substrate, soil, wood, whatever it might be. If everything goes well, they will germinate and form hyphae. And hyphae are little thin strands of cells that kind of resemble a hair-like structure, but they're much smaller than the width of a human hair. So they're not really visible in individual hyphae to the naked eye. But when they grow together into a network called mycelium, you can actually see them if you pull aside mulch or you dig into a rotting log, you might see little strands, often white colored. When two mycelia of different individuals come together and they're compatible, then they may mate. And then that's when you get your fruiting body, which is a result of sexual reproduction. And here's a cool image of the little spores looking like little clouds. You can't see an individual spore, but you can see through, you can see in this image that they scatter the light enough to actually be visible to the naked eye, the clouds of spores. So that's the difference between mushrooms and fungi, and also the similarities. We'll talk about the ecological roles of fungi now. So basically, mushrooms can be categorized in 3 different groups, depending on what they are feeding off of. So it's not the mushroom that's feeding off of this rotted wood here. These are oyster mushrooms. It's actually the mycelium, and then these are just the fruiting bodies, as I just mentioned. So saprobes are fungi that, well, all the fungi will release acids and enzymes through their mycelia, and that breaks down tissue. And in this case, for saprobes, it's dead tissue to get nutrients. So they basically break down complex molecules such as cellulose and lignin, which make up most of our tree material, the rigid parts of the trees, and are complex molecules that are difficult to break down. And fungi will often specialize in breaking down either the cellulose or the lignin, usually not both, and gain nutrients that way. And then they also simplify those compounds and make them available for future generations of plants. We got parasites. These are there's a few scary ones out there, especially if you're an insect. But parasites, they release the acids and enzymes through their mycelium to break down living tissue. They may or may not kill the host. So one that kills the host is the zombie ant fungus, which is a parasite that's in the tropical regions of our world. And they actually will manipulate the behavior of the ant. And the ant will keep living, and then eventually it goes to a top of a tree and it dies and clutches to the top of a tree, and a fruiting body, this mushroom, comes out of its head, and then it disseminates spores down on the forest floor, when usually this ant stays in the lower parts of the forest. Another parasitic fungus is chaga, and this is having a moment with people into medicinal mushrooms. This actually isn't a mushroom, but it's caused by the mycelium of the mushroom that results in this big mass that grows on birch trees. And you can break this off and actually boil this in water, and you get a nice tea out of it, which actually tastes pretty good. And there are many claims for its medicinal aspects, and those are to be debated. And then we have mycorrhizal mushrooms, and these are mushrooms that have a partner with a host, usually a tree, sometimes other plants. So the mycelia of the mushrooms will grow into the plant roots, and they will form a symbiotic relationship. So the fungi greatly amplify the root system, volume of root system, and they're much thinner, the mycelium, and they greatly enhance the ability of, so the fungi are taking up water, but then the tree is also grabbing some of that water out of the mycelial network, as well as minerals. And then in exchange, the plants will provide carbohydrates, which they produce through photosynthesis. So the fungi are getting sugars in exchange. And a good majority of our land plants have mycorrhizal relationships, and just about every tree locally around here and worldwide have an obligate relationship with a fungal partner, if not many, to thrive. And actually, both organisms need each other to thrive. And there are interesting new research. There's a book that just came out called Finding the Mother Tree by Suzanne Simard, which talks all about what some people dub the wood wide web, which is the whole network of mycelia that will actually bring multiple individuals of trees. They'll be connected with the same mycelial network. So there's claims about there is communication and cooperation, making this whole forest system more resilient. Are there any questions at this point, or should I keep going ahead into the mushroom groups?
I have them muted. Why don't we do the questions at the end, and people can also put their questions in the chat.
Sure. Okay. So major mushroom groups. If you look at a typical field guide, mushrooms are usually classified by shape and the type of spore producing surface. So one local field guide, this is basically the distribution of the different groups of mushrooms. So you often see the guild mushrooms represented as a large majority of a field guide. And then we go to boletes and polypores, cup fungi and morels. And then these other groups are much less represented, but still important species. And I'm going to talk about each one of these. So we got all 10 of these. So guild mushrooms are the ones that we're probably most familiar with, because these are the ones that we eat. So we eat only a few species of guild mushrooms. So portobello mushrooms and crimini mushrooms and the white button mushroom. Those are actually all the same species, Agaricus bisporus. And they're grown in different ways, and there's different strains. Shiitake mushrooms, of course, are guild, and oyster mushrooms are guild mushrooms. So we're familiar with that. So they're always found on the underside of the cap. They're thin, flat structures, and the purpose of the gills is to greatly increase the surface area available for producing spores. So the mushroom's whole role is just a reproductive structure. So here's a common mushroom you'll find here locally, the fern russula. If we look at a close-up of the gills, so there's like a little cross-section here. These little lines here, you can see like little fuzzy stuff. Those all represent basidia, which will be on the edge and all along the gills here and up to these undulations of the gills. And these basidia, which is plural, basidium is one single structure. So the basidium, one basidium will have 4 spores on it. And these are, the mushrooms in this group are called basidium mycetes. And that's like the phylum level just below the kingdom fungi. You got basidium mycetes. So most of the mushrooms I'm going to be talking about are basidium mycetes. So they always have 4 spores on a basidium. So they're a very large and diverse group. There's hundreds of species in the DC area. I was just out actually earlier today on a walk, and I saw a couple of different species. There are a few that actually hang around in the wintertime. Oyster mushrooms and enoki. There are hundreds of species in the DC area, every color of the rainbow. There are many good edible guild mushrooms, and there are several deadly poisonous ones. This is actually probably the most tricky group of mushrooms if you want to go out and find mushrooms to eat. Now, none of these mushrooms are poisonous to the touch. It's only when they get into your digestive tract is when you're going to have problems. So boletes look a bit like guild mushrooms. They have a stem and they have a cap, but then underneath they have this spongy pore surface. And here's a cross section. So those pores are actually tubes, like little straws, all tightly packed together. So here you can see this is a king bolete, or the porcini, and this is a choice edible mushroom. At a young stage, those pores are really tightly packed. You can barely see that they're little holes. And then as it gets older, it expands, and you can see this whole network of pores. And they actually can have a little bit of a less roundness to them, be a little bit hexagonal. Anyway, all the boletes have a cap and a stalk, and they tend to be most of them are going to be soft and fleshy. And this tube layer right here, you can actually remove from the rest of the mushroom. And for eating, some of these people will remove that tube layer because it kind of gets a little slimy when you cook it up. Just about all the boletes are mycorrhizal, so they have an obligate relationship with trees. And many are good edibles. Some will make you sick. None of the boletes that are found locally are deadly poisonous, and very few worldwide will cause serious poisoning. So polypores are another group of mushrooms that also have pores on them. So this is a turkey tail mushroom. This is the top side. If you flip this upside down, it'll have a white underside with minute pores in it. Usually you need magnification or young eyes to see these. And polypores, also known as bracket fungi or conchs. Some are thin and kind of wafer-like, and some are really thick and hard, tough, woody structures. They are all saprobes, so they all decay the wood that they're growing on. And the pore surface will not separate from the cap, unlike the boletes that we just looked at. Locally, few are toxic, and most are too tough to eat. There are some notable exceptions, such as you might have heard of chicken of the woods, or maitake is another. Chicken of the woods is one mushroom. Maitake is another mushroom. Maitake is also known as hen of the woods. And those are two really good edible mushrooms. And several are considered medicinal, including the turkey tail. Chanterelles kind of look like a gilled mushroom, but their gills, it's kind of a nuanced thing it can be to differentiate these from gilled mushrooms, but their spore producing surface has forked ridges, and so they're more considered a ridge, and the gills won't separate from the cap. Chanterelles tend to open up into a vase or trumpet shape. So we got black trumpets here, very trumpety. It's a type of, in the chanterelle group. They are all mycorrhizal, often with oak trees, sometimes with pine, beech trees too, they like around here. And I'd say many are prized edibles, but there are some lookalikes, so you need to be careful with these if you're gathering them to eat. Oops. I should, going back to the polypores and along with the steroid fungi and crust, these are mushrooms that you can find pretty much year round. A lot of these other mushrooms we've looked at so far tend to fruit in the warmer months. So these are good mushrooms to know if you just want to know about the diversity of mushrooms and what you can find all year round. So the steroid fungi look a bit like polypores. So this is the top of the fruiting body. This is the underside, but they never produce any pores or teeth. And then crust fungi, there's many different kinds of crust. There's white colored ones and brown colored ones and yellow colored ones and purple ones. And then this one, when I first learned about this, I thought it was somebody actually spray painted a piece of wood, but this is called the cobalt crust, and this can be found locally. The turkey tail is one of your really common mushrooms that you can find pretty much year round, just about on any walk in the woods. They are all saprobes, so they all decay wood, and none are considered edible. Tooth mushrooms is a small group of mushrooms that are, I guess, are evolutionarily very distantly related. So this lion's mane has these icicle-like teeth on it. Looks like a pom-pom growing from a tree. And these rotwood, the mycelium will be embedded within the wood. And then we have this depressed hedgehog, which is not depressed psychologically, it's depressed morphologically. So it has this depression in the middle. That's why it's called the depressed hedgehog. If you do find it, you will not be depressed, because this is actually a good edible. And they have little teeth on the underside. So it has a cap and a stalk. And this actually is closely related to the chanterelles. There are many good edibles. There are some that are kind of bitter and nasty tasting, but none of them are deadly poisonous. And here's another group that has a whole different strategy of disseminating its spores: puffballs and earth stars. So they are generally round balls. Sometimes they have a little bit of a stalk. In the case of an earth star, they are a round ball that initially is enclosed with a membrane that spreads out and kind of has a star-like shape around it. So it's kind of a glamorous puffball. The interior flesh of puffballs when they're young will be firm, and then as it ages, that firm material becomes a whole spore mass. And then you can see when it rains, and this is, I guess I'd say from a mechanical disturbance, they will produce a cloud of spores. And other than a curious mycologist or budding mycologist squeezing them, generally how they're going to produce their spores is through rainfall, which mushrooms need the moist, wet conditions for the spores to germinate. So it's a neat strategy that they disseminate their spores under those weather conditions. So some, but not all puffballs are edible. There are this one here called the poison pigskin puffball. Scleroderma citrinum is a poisonous puffball. So I like to say you don't need to go snorkeling in the tropical waters to see corals. So we have some mushrooms that form a coral-like structure. This is one you can occasionally find around here. There's many different kinds of corals. This is probably one of the most beautiful looking ones. So corals will have many branches that further branch into subdivisions like this. And then we get club mushrooms, which are just more single erect structures. They can often grow in clusters. And the spores are produced on the outsides of the mushroom. All those little basidia are all along these. And most of the clubs and corals are not considered edible. This is another fun, interesting group. Stinkhorns. These are pretty common. If you have mulched areas around you, you can often find these during the warm season. So the stinkhorns disseminate their spores by attracting flies and other insects that are attracted to the foul-smelling spore mass produced on here. And they often smell like some sort of fecal matter or rotting flesh. And the insects are kind of duped into landing on there. I think some of them might actually gain some nutrition out of eating the spore mass. And I think if I'm remembering correctly, it'll pass through the gut and out the other end of the fly. So it's one way, or they disseminate the spores through their feet, landing on typically on mulch or broken down wood is where you're going to see stinkhorns grow. So they're all saprobes. They're decaying the wood chips or mulch. And then some of these can actually be eaten. About 10 years ago, I got around to trying them. So if you dig around in the mulch, you clear it around where you see a fruiting body coming up, you'll see these little egg-like structures underneath. And often they're connected with mycelium. You'll see like the white thread-like structures. So within this egg will eventually erupt a stinkhorn species. And in some cultures, these are considered edible, in Asian cultures. So I got around to trying them out. I found a bunch of eggs. I boiled them up, and me and a few friends tried them out. And they weren't the most horrible thing I've ever eaten, but they also certainly weren't something that I would really try again voluntarily. But one of my friends actually enjoyed them. So it's kind of a preference of taste. Jellies are a fun group of fungi. When moist, these mushrooms have a gelatinous or rubbery consistency. There's lots of different jelly species around here. You get these yellow ones, witch's butters, you get white ones, and then you get several kind of black and brown ones. Probably all of you have eaten wood ear mushrooms before. In Chinese cooking and maybe some other Asian cultures, these are commonly used in food. If you've eaten hot and sour soup, I used to think those little strips of the chewy stuff in hot and sour soup were seaweed or something like that, but those little strips are in fact wood ears. And they're also in other like stir-fried dishes like mushu vegetables, mushu chicken. You'll see strips of wood ears in them. These dry out really easily, and then they become gelatinous again when they get wet. And this is a neat adaptation of the fruiting body of the mushroom or of the fungus, is that when they dry up, they don't produce spores. And then when they get wet, they quickly rehydrate, produce spores. And when it gets dry again, they don't produce spores. And they kind of go through the cycle over and over, and they don't have to create a new fruiting body each time. So it's a neat evolutionary way of conserving energy and resources by just having this one fruiting body that goes through these cycles over and over again. So all the mushrooms I talked about so far are basidiomycetes with that little club structure with the 4 spores. This cups, saddles, morels, and other ascomycetes, which include mold and yeast. So those are fungi that don't create mushrooms. They're in the ascomycete group, and that's another division of the kingdom fungi. So you get basidiomycetes and ascomycetes, and then there's a few other divisions. So it's kind of neat to think that like morels are in a whole, they're so far distantly related from all the other mushrooms that we just looked at, kind of like I make an analogy of vertebrates to invertebrates, which I think is a pretty close. It's maybe not exactly apples to apples, but like a jellyfish would be as distantly related to a vertebrate such as a wolf. So you could think of like a morel as being like the jellyfish, and then we were just looking at these jelly mushrooms. They might be more like a jellyfish. Okay, I hope that made sense. But anyhow, the big difference is that these mushrooms have spores in tubes called asci. So one single one is an ascus, and they generally have spores in groups of 8. So unlike the basidiomycetes, which will have their spores in groups of 4, and they eject these spores through pressure that builds up, and they make a little cloud of spores that you can see. And actually, if you come across some cup fungi and you give them a quick puff of air with your mouth and just blow on them, like a second or later, you'll see the spores come out. And if you listen really closely, you can actually hear a hiss. That's the noise of the spores being ejected out. So cups produce their spores on the inside surface, as we just saw here, right here. So unlike most of your basidiomycetes, the spores will be on the undersurface, and these will be produced on the top of the fruiting body. So we have the cups here. These are orange peel fungus, which in fact do look like orange peels from far away. And sometimes when I'm going out looking for mushrooms, I see a true orange peel, and I'm disappointed that it's not actually an orange peel fungus. So a saddle is like a cup, but it has a stalk to it, but it still has this cup, and inside it will be all of your asci. And then morels are basically like a saddle fungus with a bunch of cups all stuck together. And like, here's a cup, there's a cup, here's a big, long, elongated cup. But they're basically a bunch of cups fused together on top of a stalk. So morels are edible. False morels are can get you extremely ill. I should say morels are edible if they have been cooked well. You can get sick off of raw morels. Other ascomycetes, so in addition to the yeasts and the molds that don't make mushrooms, there are a lot of if you look closely at sticks and wood, you will see little black fruiting bodies. This is one of many different kinds of ascomycetes that you'll see on wood that are black and small. King Alfred's cakes. There's an ascomycete called dead man's fingers, which these structures will actually turn black and they look like fingers coming up out of the ground. Very nice, colorful names. There's an ascomycete called cordyceps. There's kind of a whole group of mushrooms that attack insects. This is one you can find locally called the scarlet caterpillar club fungus, Cordyceps militaris. And this is considered a very potent medicinal mushroom, especially in Asian cultures. When you see this in the forest, you'll only see from about here up, and you'll see this part of the fruiting structure, and you have to actually get a little digging implement and go down about an inch or two, and you will see that it is attached to the pupae of a I believe it's various small species. I'm not sure if it's actually one species or many species. So the spores get onto the pupae, maybe even in the caterpillar stage, and infect this, and they kill the host. And then once the conditions are right, a fruiting body will come up, and then you will see this little cordyceps mushroom coming up. All right, so those are the different groups. Now I'm going to go over traits to look for when you're out mushroom hunting. So these are different questions to ask. There's a lot of different nuances, a lot of different, some mushrooms have like one particular thing that will give them away, sometimes a smell, or sometimes how they bruise when you injure it. What color are the spores? So we'll go through all these one by one. So where is the mushroom growing is an important one. You can narrow down mushrooms sometimes, not most of them, but occasionally you get a mushroom that's very particular to one type of substrate. So this is one you really cannot get wrong around here. The magnolia cone xylaria. So this is actually an ascomycete that only grows on the magnolia cones. I think all different magnolias it'll grow on. Then you have the magic mushroom, which this particular species you do not find up here, at least not yet. Maybe with climate change and warming temperatures, one day you will, or at least I've never heard of anyone finding them here. I've found them down in Florida, where the warmer climate is particularly well suited for the magic mushrooms, the fruit, and they grow on dung. So if you think you found a magic mushroom and it's not growing on dung, it could be a different species of psilocybe, but this is the psilocybe cubensis, only grows on dung. There's a chicken fat mushroom, which is actually a bolete. So on the underside, it'll have pores. And this one grows with pine. I believe it's specifically white pine. So when it's growing, some people don't realize that mushrooms have seasons. So beyond growing in the warmer time of the year in general, many mushrooms only fruit during a specific part of the year. So white morel mushrooms, in fact, all the morel species around here, their peak season is generally mid-April. In a warmer year, I've seen them as early as late March, and in a cooler year, I've seen them maybe into the first week of May. And then brickcap mushrooms, if someone says to me, oh, I found brickcap mushrooms and it's in April, it's very doubtful it's a brickcap mushroom. They are a cool season mushroom that generally come up in late summer, early fall. Looking at how the mushrooms are how numerous the mushrooms are, how the groups are arranged can be helpful. Many mushrooms just kind of grow singly, one here, one there. You might just see one and then not see any more for a whole walk in the woods. But there are some that tend to be gregarious, that where you rarely just see one. So the wine-cap stropharia, also called the king stropharia. This is one that you can actually grow. This is probably one of the easiest ones to grow on your own. This one comes up in May, and it typically is in wood chips, and you'll typically see many fruiting bodies scattered about, not real tight, but generally like in a mulched area, you'll see a good dozen or two, or maybe even many dozen. The first time I found this one was when I first started looking for mushrooms down in DuPont Circle in one of the flower beds in the mulch. And I got very excited about it. You have mushrooms which grow in troops. This cross-vein troop mushroom is really a delight to see. You can see just logs covered with these little fruiting bodies, and there'll be just many, many, and we call that a trooping mushroom. And then when the troops get really close together and they fuse together at one point, all the stems of the mushrooms, this is called cespitose. And honey mushrooms grow cespitose, and jack-o'-lanterns and Gymnopolis, Big Laughing Jim, is also another one that grows cespitose. Not too many grow that way. And this is a lot of different shapes, morphology to look at. I don't even know all these terminologies, all these terms here, but some ideas that I want to bring across are like the way the cap's arranged, or the way the shape of the cap. You get these various shapes. The way the margin, which is the edge of the cap, is arranged. It can be helpful. Gill attachment can be helpful, particularly mushrooms that are where the gills don't quite meet the stem can be important, and where the gills come down the stem, decurrent. That's like an oyster mushroom. And we got stem shapes here. So when you go out on a walk with a person who's helping to identify mushrooms, often you're going to be pulling the mushrooms up and looking at the underside, but also you want to dig down and see if there's any structures from where the mushroom is coming out, especially out of the ground. So some have bulbous bottoms that you want to dig out to make sure you can see that. Some even root down a couple inches. And then gill spacing. If you look at the undersides of a gilled mushroom, the gills can be pretty distant. Different species have different proximities, and some are very crowded together. Another structure to look for is a universal veil, and some gilled mushrooms have a veil that completely surrounds a mushroom when it's starting to form. So Amanita is a genus of mushrooms, which are many of the sections of Amanita, of the Amanita genus, will grow out of what is called a universal veil. So it's like a sac that this whole mushroom was enclosed in. And this one, which you can find locally around here in the summer months, real striking, beautiful mushroom, will erupt and will leave the remnants of this universal veil. Sometimes the veil will not really show much on the bottom, but will be little patches that will cling to the cap and break apart. On this blusher, another Amanita species, you get these little remnants of the universal veil, and these actually rub off pretty easily. They're not part of the cap, they're part of the membrane that covered it. So you want to dig down, and because you can't always see this, you might need to dig down an inch or so to pull that up. I have another structure which is called the partial veil. Here's a good example here. The partial veil covers the gill or the spore producing area, because you can find these also on boletes, the pored mushrooms. So you can find a partial veil on some species of gilled mushrooms and some species of the boletes. And before the cap fully opens, the partial veil the idea is that it's protecting the gills before they start producing spores. And then once the cap expands, you will see that there's often a remnant of the partial veil, which leaves a ring or a skirt on the stem. So that can be an important characteristic to look for. And you can actually see these are the spores of the gills that are getting stuck onto the partial veil. This is Cortinarius is another genus, which are also known as the web caps, and they have a very webby partial veil. So color can be important, but sometimes it can be a little deceiving, can throw you off because it can vary as a mushroom ages, and also dryness and moisture. So colored patterns can be pretty important to look at. So some of your amanitas, this one, the grisette, has these little striate margins, which are an important characteristic to look for. This is a beautiful mushroom, which I've only found a couple times around here, called the indigo milk cap, which has these concentric rings, and that is called zonate. Then we get marginate here, which on the edge of the gill, there's a dark coloration. So you have to really get down into the minutia of looking at mushrooms sometimes, and this might differentiate two mushrooms that are closely related, but one has a marginate gill. Hygrophanous is this part of the mushroom is more moist and this part is drier, and so color can change just from the amount of moisture left in the cap. Texture is another thing to look at. So we get mushrooms that are real scaly. If we get somewhere between hairy and scaly, you get this fibrillose, scurfy look. Reticulation is what you'll see on some boletes, have these really ornately decorated stems. And then we get viscid mushrooms, which are kind of slimy to the touch. Wax caps are a group of mushrooms that tend to be viscid when there's enough moisture. So another thing you do when you pick a mushroom and you suspect it might be something that might have an interesting reaction when you cut or bruise it. So some mushrooms will bleed. So milk caps will, when you just take a knife and drag it along the gills, and in fact, any part, if you cut the stem, they will bleed out a latex. And some of the milk caps are actually good edibles, and some of them are really spicy and will burn your tongue and probably give you a pretty good tummy ache. There's another group of gilled mushrooms called the mycenas. Some people call them fairy helmets for a common name. And the bleeding fairy helmet is probably one of the easier ones of the mycenas to identify, because you cut open the stem and it looks a little reddish. And then it'll ooze out this little reddish liquid. So a lot of boletes will stain when you injure them. So you can see this little animation here and how quick they stain. They will oxidize. There's a compound in there that will oxidize once it's exposed to the air. And then this is a polypore called the artist's conch. And this is a mushroom that doesn't really stain, but it has a very thin white outer layer. And then once you get right below that, it has this darker layer. So it's actually like kind of like a blank slate, and you can do much prettier artwork than writing this on them. And if you Google artist conch and artwork, you can actually sometimes see these sold at like nature artists displays or shows. So smell can actually be quite important. If you hang around people that are on a mushroom walk, the leaders will often pick a mushroom and smell them as one of the first things they do. And there's a lot of different smells that you can get off of mushrooms. Many species of chanterelles have an apricot-y kind of fruity smell. What's it taste like? So no mushroom is poisonous to the taste. Just make sure none of it gets past your mouth and down into your throat and into your digestive tract. That's when you're going to have trouble. But I'm not going to condone going out there and just tasting any mushroom. But you will see mycologists will take a little, they'll break the mushroom and take a little lick, or maybe even tear off a small piece on the tip of their tongue, chew it a little bit and spit it out. and then you can get a taste from that mushroom. This peppery milk cap, not right away, but after about 10 seconds of tasting it, it'll build up an intense fiery feeling on your mouth, which eventually goes away after a couple of minutes, but it can be pretty painful. Kind of a fun practical trick to do to unsuspecting newbies. It's kind of mushroom initiation. But this can be an important way to also identify mushrooms. And then lastly is the color of the spores. And you might have heard of taking a spore print. Not only can this make beautiful art, it's also practical in terms of getting the color of the spores of the mushrooms. So you simply cut the stalk off right here, put the mushroom cap side down, and you can put it on white paper. Some have very white spores, so you won't really see you can barely make out the difference between the white paper. So you might do it on half white paper, half black paper. You can cover it with the bowl, especially if you have a lot of air currents, because the spores might blow off, but you really don't need to do that. Wait a couple of hours, and within an hour or two, it should develop a spore print if the spores are dropping. So this one, the spores look the same color as the gills, but there are some mushrooms that the spores are actually quite different looking color than the gills. So it can be an important way to help identify your mushroom. So if you look in a field guide, you will see pretty much all these characteristics I just talked about. And often mushrooms, like all the gilled mushrooms, will be classified according to spore color in a field guide. So you see all your white spored mushrooms in the beginning, and then they go to pink ones, and then light browns and black, and so on. So if you have a friend or a mycologist and you want to get an identification of a mushroom, it's important to capture as many of these traits as possible. Many people will send me pictures of mushrooms, and they just send me a picture of the mushroom like this, and that's all I see. But it's very important to show the underside of the mushroom to know whether it's pored or gilled or what other structures might be on there. So this is a good picture because it shows the mushroom on the substrate. So it's growing on wood. We have a little reference point for size right here. We have the underside of it. We have a couple different stages of growth. So we have some younger caps and some older caps here. And I don't think in this picture we have checked for any bleeding or bruising reactions, but that would be good to add too. And often it's good to cut a mushroom in half and show the profile of it too. Okay, hope everyone's hanging in there. We're getting to the fun part here. So this is 4 mushrooms in the DC area that can kill you. And they're not going to kill you by being thrown at you. They're not going to kill you by touching you. They're going to kill you because you have ingested them. So most of the mushrooms out there are pretty innocuous. Many of them, like the polypores, are too tough to eat. Another quarter, 25% or so of mushrooms out there by species are not harmful. Maybe about 20% might make you sick, but not deadly ill. So it could be sick from just a mild rumbly stomach to maybe you're hanging out in the bathroom for a couple of days. And then there's a very small percentage of species that can kill you. And according to this chart here, maybe 4% of the species you come across will be worth foraging. And there's an old adage that you'll hear when you're hanging around mushroom people: all mushrooms are edible, sometimes only once. Another one you hear is there are old mushroom hunters and bold mushroom hunters, but very few old and bold mushroom hunters. So this is the mushroom that is responsible for the most poisonings here on the East Coast, the deadly poisonings that cause serious health effects and can lead to death. This is called the destroying angel. It's a beautiful mushroom. It's in the genus Amanita. It's an all white mushroom. It has a big sac here, or vulva. It has a partial veil here. So this is the remnant of the universal veil. This is the partial veil. It has a white spore print. This is it before the cap has expanded. So sometimes it can be totally enclosed in this egg shape here. So you want to make sure you don't confuse it with a puffball or a stinkhorn. So they contain a chemical called amatoxin. If you get sick from eating a mushroom within 6 hours or less, that's generally a good thing. If it takes longer, that's generally a bad thing. So the destroying angel can take, 6 hours to a day before you start feeling symptoms, and you will get violently ill with projectile vomiting and diarrhea and probably blood in the stool. And then after a few days, you might start feeling like you're getting better, but then the amatoxins start attacking your liver and kidney. And at that point, if you've had a big enough dose, you may die without any medical intervention. Sometimes you need a liver transplant. I was just leading a walk a couple of weeks ago, and someone was telling me their son in Richmond, Virginia, had just treated a few people for amatoxin poisoning. And actually, I think it was a family of 3 or 4, and a couple of them died. And they were from Southeast Asia, which is often the case. They're often immigrants who don't know anything about our local mushrooms, but they confuse this with a mushroom that grows where they are originally from, called the paddy straw mushroom, which looks similar to this. So this is usually, if you hear about mushroom poisoning in the local area, it's or mushroom deaths, it's usually from this one. This is another mushroom that has the same exact toxin in it, but is in a whole different genus and very distantly related to the destroying angel. This is called the funeral bell, or the deadly skullcap. Sometimes you hear it called the deadly gallerina, named after its genus. These are little brown mushrooms. Sometimes you hear them called LBMs, little brown mushrooms. Avoid all little brown mushrooms because of this guy here. And it has this dark, rusty spore print. It has a partial veil. This is before the cap is fully expanded. When the cap is opened up, this is the remnant of the partial veil. It's a small mushroom that comes up in the fall. I see this quite a bit in the fall. It likes old, kind of wet, rotted logs. So here you can see really nicely those the little minute zone of the partial veil that was left on there. So avoid those LBMs. False morel. This is, I don't see very much around here. This is a really cool looking mushroom. It generally comes up a little bit before the main species of morels come up. So like late March, earlier side of April. And they look quite a bit different from a morel. This one, the esculenta, Gyrometra esculenta, looks maybe more like a typical morel, and I'll have some slides that compare them side by side. But if you cut these in half, they have a solid chambered or cottony interior, which a morel would be hollow. So they contain gyrometrin, which upon digestion gets metabolized as a chemical. I think it's methyl something hydrazine. I'm not a biochemist, but it's basically equivalent to rocket fuel. This is another one where the symptoms can take a while to present, and this can cause severe poisoning. So this is what you need to avoid. And this would be in the late winter, more early spring is when these would come up. Now in Europe, from what I understand, a lot of people will boil these, and then the toxin gets leached out, and then they eat them afterwards. But most North American mycologists don't touch these. There's another local mushroom that also causes, this one causes more of a buildup reaction that if you eat it repetitively over time. And it's, yeah, there's many more that will make you, this is probably the one that makes the most people sick, doesn't kill them, because this will grow in lawns. This is called the green gill mushroom. And if you actually take a spore print of this, it'll have a greenish color to it. It's the only mushroom locally that has a green spore print. But these grow in people's lawns and often make fairy rings, little circles. Pretty common mushrooms. So from accessibility, people are like, oh, a big mushroom growing in my yard, I'm going to try it out. Okay, let's go on to some edibles. So before eating anything, apply the banana test. You are so familiar with a banana that if no one could really talk you out of eating a banana. That is, if you like to eat bananas. So that's kind of the rule you should use with mushrooms, is either you or the person who is providing them to you should be so positive and have eaten them several times before that you should feel confident and not have any doubt about eating this mushroom. So here's your morels. So all these morels are hollow stalked, several different species. This is the one that comes up the earliest, these two, and then the yellow morel. And these can be found with our tulip poplar trees in mid-April, mid to late April is kind of their peak time. All have hollow stems. So morel, false morel. Giant puffball, this is one that you really can't confuse for any other fungus. You might confuse it for a soccer ball or a piece of styrofoam, but generally you're not going to want to eat that. When you cut it in half, it should be uniformly white. Some people call this tofu of the woods or tofu of the field, because actually it tends to grow more in open areas, not deep in a forest. So they don't have a lot of taste to them, but you can cook these up as big slabs and bread them and flavor them. They make pretty good mushroom. There are some smaller puffballs that can be a little trickier, and that's what this is talking about. So here's your nice fresh giant puffball. This is when it's sporulating, starting to turn to spore mass. And then this is actually an amanita, which is not, this is actually a pretty good size one, probably about 2-3 inches, but you can see the cross section of the mushroom in here. The cap, the gills, and the stem. Chicken of the woods, this is a very common mushroom you can find from April through maybe November, peaking out in late summer and early fall. There's 2 species that are around here that are good edibles. One on the underside of each lobe here is yellow, and it's pored mushroom. It's a polypore. You'd have to get up closer and magnify that to see the pores. And then this is so this I call the yellow chicken of the woods. And this one I call the white chicken of the woods. And that has a white pore surface on the underside of these lobes. This has kind of a more salmony color, and this is more orangey yellow. This is also called sulfur shelf because of more sulfur yellow colors like an egg yolk. These, I'd say about 1 out of every 10 people who eat this get a rumbly tummy. Usually nothing worse than a little GI upset, but it's actually a pretty commonly eaten mushroom, but it can cause some GI upset in some people. I would say, shoot, now I forgot what I was going to say. Oh, it's called chicken of the woods because it supposedly tastes like chicken. And it's one of my favorite edible mushrooms. I eat a lot of different kinds of them, but this is one of the easier ones to identify. Hen of the woods, there's something going on with poultry and mushrooms. This is called hen of the woods, not because it tastes like a hen, but because it supposedly looks like a hen fluffed up at the base of a tree. This is going to be found in October and almost always with oaks. And this year wasn't a great year for hen of the woods in my experience and some other people I talked with, but some years you can find just like pounds and pounds off of one tree. This is also known as maitake and considered medicinal by folks out there. So boletes that don't stain blue, don't have red pores, and that don't taste bitter are also considered edible, and that's locally. So they have a cap and a stalk. They have a separable tube layer, so there's pores on the underside, and they always grow out of the ground. So these are a couple. Actually, you don't see king bolete around here, but this is a pretty common one. Old man of the woods. Pretty distinctive mushroom. I've never tried it, but it is supposedly edible. And this is the last slide, I believe. These are some guides that I like to use. There's mushrooms of northeastern U.S. This one of West Virginia and Central Appalachians. Both of these cover most of the mushrooms in the area here, and then several other guides. Oh, I guess there is. This is the final slide. But it's always, I would say, looking at those guides is great. It helps you get familiarized and with the images and terminology, but going out on walks is the best way to learn. And that's how I've learned most of what I learn, or reinforced what I think I learned. So the local group, Mycological Association of Washington, the local mushroom group, we lead forays, which are basically mushroom walks. And we have ID tables. We have monthly meetings the first Tuesday of every month. We have a particular expert on various topics, from culinary to what else? The mushroom natural history. Lots and lots of topics. Psychedelic mushrooms, very popular, with well attended. iNaturalist and Mushroom Observer are two apps that you can use to help identify mushrooms. If you're on Facebook, which I'm not, but this is a good page, or a good Facebook site where you post a picture and people will chime in on what they think it is. Learn Your Land is a guy who does a lot of cool YouTube videos on mushrooms and a lot of other natural history topics. And then This Is My Business, where I lead mushroom walks periodically from time to time. So I think that's pretty much it. Thank you for your attention.
And again, thank you. Thank you, everybody. You have a million questions. Go unmute everybody. We're going to try to hit the chat and however many questions we can. So let's go at it. And so let's hit a few of the questions in the chat first. Can you see the chat, Matt?
Yeah, I can bring it up.
Lichens, people often confuse lichens, mushrooms. There's a person who asked, where do lichens fit in?
Where do lichens fit in? Oh, that's good. I didn't include that. So that's something I should add in the slides. So lichens are considered fungi. There's many different lichen species. So they're defined as the fungus that is a predominant part of the organism. So fungi are generally 90% fungus and 10% photobiont, which is a photosynthetic partner, usually algae, so something in the plant kingdom.
And would someone like to jump in before I take more from the...
I want to ask you a question.
Thank you, sir.
On the very poisonous mushrooms, if you see them in your front yard or something, does it hurt you to mow them down or push them off or something, or should you not?
Only if they jump up into your mouth and you swallow it. If you touch them, it's perfectly fine. In fact, you can taste them. There's a expert in the genus Amanita, a national expert, maybe worldwide expert, who actually puts a little bit has put a little bit of the deadly poisonous mushroom in his mouth and tastes it, and it does have a good taste according to folks who do that, but he spits it out and you're still will be fine. I don't do that little trick, but it just goes to show that it's only if it's ingested.
There's never a dermatoxic effect, or
I have asked a few mycologists this, and the answer I've gotten is, someone told me there's a coral mushroom in Japan that is actually will give you a a burning sensation. They call it a fire coral. But locally, I haven't.
Thank you, Professor Matt, for the presentation. And I have a question. Have you mentioned about truffles?
Pardon?
Truffles.
Don't understand.
Truffles.
A little trouble hearing you.
Truffle, I think.
Truffles. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, so truffles. Yeah, what's your question?
Which group will you include them?
Oh, so truffles are actually interesting. They're from many different lineages, and I guess that's called convergent evolution. So it's actually mushrooms that have taken to growing underground, but there are mushrooms.
True.
Yeah, so it's an interesting evolutionary strategy that by living underground, they don't have to worry about all the outside
and they're very costly
factors.
Yeah.
But
they're
many
costly and nutritious. I know. I was searching for one. I never. But in this area where I'm living, I mean, there are. Anyway, thank you, Professor Matt, for the wonderful talk.
Somebody asked if the different colors of mushrooms represent different evolutionary or ecological functions.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for that. I don't think there is a particular evolutionary strategy going on with most of the mushroom colors. They might just be like secondary attributes.
Matt, my tree fellow told me that if I see mushrooms around the trunk of my oak tree, that it means that there's something wrong with the oak tree, that it's either dying or something, but it doesn't sound like it. It sounds like the mushrooms are actually part of the growth.
Well, it depends. You have parasitic mushrooms, which will kill your tree. You have saprophytic mushrooms, the saprobes, which will decay any dead part of a tree. And then you have mycorrhizal mushrooms, which actually benefit the tree. So it really depends on which species you have and what its role is. So yeah, I mean, just like any kingdom, from the human centric viewpoint, there are good mushrooms and there are bad mushrooms.
So I have to ID it and send it to you. I mean, take a picture.
Yeah. In general, finding big fruiting bodies coming off of your tree is not a good thing. If you find like mushrooms growing in the grass near your tree or in the soil near your tree, then that usually it can be either neutral or they might be beneficial. That's kind of a quick and dirty. And when you see the mushroom growing from the tree, it's too late because it's at the stage where it has enough energy that it can actually produce a fruiting body, but the mycelium has already infected the tree.
Okay. I haven't seen them, but he just told me about it.
In the chat, someone asks about the classification you show on your slides. You mentioned that plants are distinguished from fungi by their capacity to make their own food photosynthetically. But there are other plants like Indian pipe and beach drops, which, yeah, go for it.
That's a good, there's always exceptions, right? We try to make neat boxes out of all this, but yeah, those are, so the beach drops and Indian pipe, their lineage comes from photosynthetic plants that they have adapted to just parasitizing off of other living organisms. And actually a fun thing, beach drops, from what I understand, actually directly parasitize the roots of beech trees, but Indian pipe actually parasitizes mycelium of Russula species mushrooms, which grow mycorrhizally with tree roots. So that's a fun little aside there.
Anybody want to jump in before I
see down here someone had a question about using Tyrannocerulea, the cobalt crust fungus, to dye fabric. I don't believe there is, but there are several species of mushrooms out there that are there's a whole kind of sub community in the mycological world of people who use mushrooms for dyeing, and also lichens, which are, you know, a type of fungus, but they also use those for dyeing fabric.
So again, thank you all for joining. You know, our makerspace is open. If anyone wants to know more about the makerspace, contact the Science Center. For those of you out of towners, thank you for joining us today. And next time, we